Hi fellas. Thanks for your support. Welcome to Movie Narrator channel. Today we are going to look a science fiction, thriller movie. Life. Be ready to get thrilled. The unmanned Pilgrim 7 space probe returns from Mars to Earth orbit with soil samples potentially containing evidence of extraterrestrial life. The probe is intercepted by the International Space Station. The astronauts' hope carries confirmation of life from the Red Planet. Sadly, the Pilgrim Wars damaged and deviates from its course. Rory suits up and prepares for a spacewalk. Their plan is: Rory need to go outside the space station and controls a mechanical arm to catch the Pilgrim. Other astronauts are helping with this task. Astronauts keep their nerves while navigating the station. Their commander, Ekaterina, and another astronauts Sho Murakami, were at the station's command center, supervising the mission. They finally got the visuals of the Pilgrim capsule as it approaching the station. Rory operates the arm into position, and as the Pilgrim makes contact, the whole station pushed back. The astronauts are shaken a bit. Rory completed his task of catching the Pilgrim. All astronauts celebrated this as Ekaterina reports to NASA that the Pilgrim capsule has successfully landed on the station. At the lab, Derry carefully takes samples from a container and focuses them under a microscope. He finds out that an organism nearly fossilized in the sample. He briefs everyone that the organism in the sample is something similar to a single-cell organism. Exobiologist Derry tries to restore and reanimate the organism, but his attempt were unsuccess, and then tried to create an atmosphere closer to a Proterozoic Earth and adds growth hormone. Everyone's surprised when the organism becomes active. Derry gasps, as they've confirmed life from another planet. Astronauts team goes into a call from Earth. News outlets and large crowds are all celebrating the discovery of extraterrestrial life. The astronauts chat with students claiming that their school had been given an extraordinary chance to name the organism. The children settled to name the organism Calvin. After the call, the astronauts resume their mission. Quarantine officer Miranda had a conversation with physician David. Worrying that David had been on the station for a long period of time, David replied that he is too comfortable living in the space. Next day, Derry continued testing the Calvin. Derry found that Calvin has grown rapidly, developing a neural network. Derry explains that Calvin's cells can perform every normal activities each of on its own, meaning that Calvin's each cell is a brain, a muscle, and an eye. After a while, everyone disperses as David look after his injuries and ailments, and Murakami spoke with his family, and Derry continues interacting with Calvin. As many weeks passed, Space Station got an alarm. All astronauts hurried to the lab. Rory tries to fix the malfunction. Miranda urges Derry that keeping Calvin contained inside the container should be their first priority as they don't know what Calvin capable of. Derry tend to attach towards Calvin. Later, all reckons that Calvin may have entered into hibernation as a defense mechanism when the lab malfunction happened. Miranda orders the crew that Calvin and the lab must remain sealed off at all times. Derry had a conversation with Miranda regarding Calvin. Derry believes Calvin cells could able to cure any disease. Derry convinces everyone to give a small electric shock to Calvin to wake him up. In the lab, Derry prepares to electrocute Calvin, while rest of the crew keep a watch from outside the lab. After several electrical shocks, Calvin swiftly woke and latches onto Derry's hand and break the electric wand. The crew tries to remain static as Calvin grip hardens. Derry tries withdraw, but Calvin's strength overpowers him. Derry starts screaming in pain as Calvin squeezes his hands. Calvin begins to break Derry's fingers as now Derry shouts for help. Miranda stopped the crew members from helping, saying that they can't risk another crew member life at stake. As the crew arguing over this, Calvin breaks Derry's hand. Derry lost his conscious and begins to float. Using the broken wand, Calvin breaks free from the container. Everyone got stunned watching this. Calvin attacks a lab rat, wrapping itself around the rat and digesting it. Rory enters the lab and saves Derry, but he got locked by David since David noticed that Calvin latched onto Rory's legs. Rory burns Calvin with an oxygen candle, but it jumps off. Ekaterina orders Rory to kill the alien. Rory tries to incinerate Calvin, but Calvin runs around the lab, hiding. But Rory chases after it. Rory attempted to capture Calvin in a container, but Calvin attacks him from behind. Calvin grabs Rory's head and enters into Rory through his mouth. Rory choked with vomiting blood from his mouth, while the crew watching this with terror. No one to help him. Rory's body floated as he died. The incinerator triggers a fire alarm, and as fire suppressant gas fills the lab, Calvin leaves Rory. Feeding off Rory, Calvin have grown enormously. Murakami and Ekaterina try manually closing the gas as Calvin could use the vent as a way out, but Calvin escapes through a fire control vent. A distress call to NASA was sent by Ekaterina, but they found transmission has failed. Ekaterina suits up and went outside station to rectify the transmitter. After she opens the coolant chamber and she noticed it empty, she suspects that Calvin may have consumed the coolant. Suddenly, Calvin launches itself out of the coolant chamber and latches onto the commander. She makes her way back to the station airlock, but Ekaterina drowning with liquid as Calvin has ruptured her coolant tube. Liquid disrupts her vision. David rushes to the airlock to save Ekaterina. Ekaterina reaches the airlock, but Ekaterina deliberately locks herself out to save the crew from Calvin. Eventually she drowns and float away. Calvin climb back to the ship. David mourns. Murakami tells them Calvin could still enter the station through the thrusters. They inspects the thrusters. Murakami ignites it, trying to kill Calvin. Sadly, as a result, the fuel in the station drains out. Murakami used the remaining fuel to put the station back in the orbit. Derry theorizes that Calvin's species must have been a top predator for millions of years in Mars, but went into hibernation when Mars' atmosphere became unstable. He suggests they should create the same atmosphere levels on the station to force Calvin back into hibernation. They retreat to a capsule and seal all area, and they cut oxygen supply to all places except theirs. Miranda observes Derry is getting weaker and faints. The crew tries to help stabilize Derry. The crew discovers that, due to Derry being a paraplegic with no feeling below the waist, Calvin had been wrapped around his leg and feeding off of him. They are then attacked. They rush out and get split up. Murakami seals himself inside a sleeping pod, while Calvin tries to break inside. David and Miranda North use Derry's corpse as bait to lure Calvin away and trap it in the other side. They then lock themselves off and purge oxygen from the other compartments. Calvin starts suffocating when they suddenly get a proximity warning. They look out the window and see a Soyuz spacecraft intercepts the ISS in an attempt to push it into deep space. This is a fail-safe to protect Earth. Miranda reveals that its job is to push them into deep space, ensuring no alien life would ever reach Earth. Believing this to be a rescue, Murakami boards the Soyuz. He is followed by Calvin. Miranda and David rushes to inform Murakami, but they are too late. They see the Soyuz crew getting wiped out and the Soyuz link breaks away. A docking breach occurs between the two stations fails. Murakami sacrifices himself in an unsuccessful attempt to trap Calvin in the Soyuz. The Soyuz detaches and crashes into the space station, causing the station's orbit to decay again. But Calvin manages to cling to the station. David helps Miranda climb up and manages to lock Calvin out. The station begins to crumble down. David speculates that Calvin could survive re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, leaving them about 30 minutes before the station re-enters the Earth atmosphere. With depleting oxygen, David planned to lure Calvin into one of the two escape pods using oxygen candles. Once inside, David will manually pilot the pod containing Calvin into deep space, isolating it and allowing Miranda to return to Earth in the other pod. David carefully crosses over the station with oxygen candles, and Calvin shows up and hugs his oxygen candle. David flees and uses another candle to lure Calvin. David gets to the escape pod, and Calvin rushes in and pounds on him, confirming that David has made it to the pod with Calvin. Miranda enters the other pod. David launches his pod, and he moved towards deep space. Miranda then launches. Miranda started her narration about what happened in the station for a black box recording. She proposes treating all Martian organisms as dangerous and asks to use all possible ways to eliminate Calvin if it ever reaches Earth. Meanwhile, both capsules hit by debris, and both begin malfunctioning. Calvin tightens David's hand, but he tries his best to maintain his trajectory. Miranda Pod's navigation systems start malfunctioning. David screams in pain as Calvin wraps around his arm. One pod finally enters the Earth atmosphere while the other heads into deep space. Eventually, the pod lands on the sea and is found by Vietnamese fishermen. The fishermen find turns out to be David's pod. Calvin doesn't kill David, but it wraps him in a form of cocoon-forming tendrils. The fishermen work together to open the pod, and David tries to warn them, but they can't understand him. Despite his warnings, fishermen then open pod and other boats are shown arriving at the scene. Miranda's pod is shown flying uncontrollably into deep space while she screams, "Fellas, be strong!" Is Calvin just a fiction till now? I hope this movie would have feed off your thriller sense. If you like this video, please like, share to your friends. Also subscribe to Movie Narrator channel for more movies.